Good to go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. I see you joining in here. Just welcome. We will start shortly. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We see people joining as we come, so just letting you know, we'll start shortly. Our goal is to start around 11-ish, and just to be able to give individuals a chance to join in. Thank you. Thank you, Chad. Chad just said thank you for having a round two with this talk. The first one was very informative. We appreciate your feedback. We're very honored to have Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox here on our call today. So, and them giving us some more time, right? Because it is valuable time that they're providing to us. So for those joining in and to our Facebook Live, we are also thanking you for joining. You are currently muted. We will be utilizing the chat and Q&A features. So again, thanks for joining. We'll start here soon.
Yeah, thanks for those comments too. I've got a fan running in the background. Gladys, just want to make sure that's not causing any issues with audio.
I'm not hearing it. I also have a fan in the background.
Yeah, I don't hear anything. I don't hear any like audio discrepancy.
Okay.
All right, it's 11 o'clock. We are going to give people a little bit of time to join us. So please sit back, relax. This will be starting shortly. Thank you, Wendy, for the comment on the link. I'm unsure if we can do anything about that, but if anybody else had an experience and you had an invalid link, please share that with us in the chat. That may be something we can look up or look into for the next conversation. Again, thank you for joining in. We are going to start shortly. We do want to give individuals a time to join in. Well, I think it's fair to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have you be part of the second conversation that we're having here with Dr. Clark and Mr. Chris Cox. Let's go ahead and get the correct slide up here for you all. Okay, so first and foremost, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Black Experience in Rural Nebraska. We truly are grateful to be able to have Dr. Clark and Chris Cox, Mr. Chris Cox here again. My name is Gladys Godinez. I am a community organizer with the Center for Rural Affairs, and I'm truly grateful to be able to continue this conversation. My coworker, Jordan Fireherm, is also a community organizer, and he's currently doing the much needed IT work, so thank you, Jordan. We are grateful to those that have watched part 1 of this conversation and encourage those that have missed it to please take some time to watch it. We want to thank our panelists, Dr. Beverly Clark and Mr. Chris Cox, for agreeing to do a part 2 of this very needed conversation. We also want to thank our co-host, American Civil Liberties Union, also known as ACLU of Nebraska, YWCA of Adams County, YWCA of Grand Island, and the Center for Rural Affairs. Lastly, we would like to thank you all for making this a great event. We have experienced a great response to the first conversation and are truly grateful for all of your feedback. For those that were able to register for part 1 via Zoom, you were able to receive an email alongside a survey. We found some themes in those questions received from the survey, so the first half of the conversation will be focused on those themes. We also have more time for interaction in regards to questions in the second half of the conversation. And we do want you to know that today's conversation is part of a bigger series of conversations named the Rural Experience Series, and I will provide more information towards the end of this conversation. Again, welcome. All right, here's the agenda for the day. The art, I do want to focus on the art. The art is by Amplifier Art Foundation. Amplifier is a design lab that builds art to amplify the voices of grassroots movements. I encourage you to check them out. And then let's see. The first part, I do want to take a couple of minutes to do some reflections on the conversations itself. We'll be doing some housekeeping, community rules, introductions, and the biggest part of it all will be conversation, Q&A, and we'll be sharing some resources with you all in regards to the themes that we'll be talking about today. All right, some reflections. Again, the Center for Rural Affairs, I am a community organizer here, and we're striving to increase our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, not only to our communities, but we're also doing it on for ourselves within our organization for continued self-evaluation and development. I would like to share a quote from our Executive Director, Brian Depew. We must speak up for our neighbors, for all Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. There cannot be social and economic justice nor opportunity for all who live in our communities without an end to racism. Our mission and our values call on us to work and end racism, and the Center has evolved and will continue to evolve to meet this challenge. So I did want to let you all know that the Center for Rural Affairs is currently working not only externally but internally on those efforts. I also want to reflect on the purpose of this conversation. We truly want to have this space to host truly amazing people in rural Nebraska that want to share their stories. In that, we are participants and listeners. As participants and listeners, we also have to take some time to reflect. It is not the job of people of color to teach you their experiences. This conversation is a gift from our panelists in that they're opening up and sharing their experiences. But, and that's a capital B-U-T, it is on us to delve in, read, interact, and reach out, and most importantly, grow. So please take that time to understand that this is a gift, the time that Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox are giving us, and that we ourselves have to do our research and learn and grow. We also want to acknowledge that we do not have Black women represented in the panel. Black women also make up our rural population and make our state of Nebraska vibrant and powerful. Lastly, I also want to say that the experience shared by Dr. Beverly Clark and Mr. Chris Cox are theirs and theirs alone. It is not our responsibility to search for credibility. It is on us to listen, believe, and continue to learn. Okay, so those are my reflections. I did want to share those with you. We've had various conversations since the first conversation, so I do want to make sure that we all are aware of that at the beginning of this conversation. All right. So in regards to housekeeping, I do want to share with you that at the bottom of your screen, you should have a similar image to this. You have a chat, and you can raise your hand, and you can do a Q&A. Jordan will be looking at both of those boxes for us. The chat box, please write your name and where are you joining us from. The Q&A, please post your questions in the Q&A box below. Just so you know, the Q&A section does have a vote piece. So if you want to vote up a question, we will try our best to get to those questions and make sure we answer them for you, or we try our best to answer them for you. Let's see. All right, our community rules: respect for all. We respect each other and ourselves, including being mindful of one another's time. Bring our best selves. We are present in both body and mind, and we refrain from blaming or shaming ourselves and others. Assume positive intent. We strive to be open to hard conversations and welcome feedback as a way to improve interactions with others. Step up and step back. When we speak often, we step back by listening to others, and if we tend to be silent, we step up to share our experiences. And then words have power. We're mindful that words have power and consider how our words will be received. So please be intentional with the conversation that you come with today. We welcome all conversations, but we do want to make sure that you understand that this is a as safe as possible place and location for learning as well as sharing. Well, let's get to it, right? Let's get to the introductions. Dr. Beverly Clark is here joining us. He is the Dean of Academic Education at Central Community College. He has worked in higher education for 17 years as an administrator, professor, and researcher. Beverly is an advocate for equality and has diligently worked to create and support diverse and inclusive educational environments. He is a resident of Grand Island and is active in the racial and social equality movement in the Grand Island and Hastings community. Before moving to Nebraska, Beverly was an associate professor of physics at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. In addition to teaching physics, Beverly performed research on the environmental impacts of microplastics. Beverly is a native of Java, Virginia, and has lived in Nebraska for just over 2 years. He attended college at Emory and Henry College, where he was a student athlete, lettering and football, and earning a bachelor's degree in physics. Upon completing college, he taught English as a second language in Brazil for a year, and then after he attended graduate school in the Department of Physics at North Carolina State University. In 2003, Beverly earned a Master's of Science and completed a PhD in 2009. In 2018, he left Raleigh to assume the position of Dean of Instruction in the Academic Education Division of Central Community College. And in his spare time, he enjoys playing music, cooking, and gardening. And like we mentioned before, he's also our very own Ironman in Central Nebraska. So welcome, Dr. Clark. We appreciate having you here.
Thanks so much. Glad to join again.
Thank you. And then now I want to talk about Christopher Cox. He is an 8th grade football coach and host of the multiple podcasts Disorder. Chris has dedicated his career to coaching and mentoring diverse youth. He lives in Lexington, Nebraska. Christopher's career has encompassed being a programs director of the Orthman Community YMCA, a social worker for the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, a wraparound reach care coordinator at La Causa in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Chris is a native of New York City, having grown up and spent time in the boroughs of the Bronx and Brooklyn, attending high school at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, graduating in the summer of 1999. Chris's athletic talents were noticed by coaches from Morningside College, who recruited him and started his life living in the Midwest. Arriving in Sioux City, Iowa, Chris began his career as a student athlete, studying mass communications and English literature, as well as becoming a founding member of the campus advocate group Cross by Colors and captain of the football team. When Chris is not working, he enjoys watching movies, playing, watching football, writing short stories, poetry, and creating inspirational videos. Welcome, Chris, to the conversation. We're truly happy to have you again at this panel.
Thanks for having me again. It was awesome. It was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, let's see. Oops. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here my PowerPoint presentation. And I want to, again, just be mindful of this conversation. And one of the things that people brought up during the feedback, which is so, it was very interesting because I didn't even think about it until after our conversation last time, is just the question, how is it living in rural Nebraska? The title says it, right? The Black Experience in Rural Nebraska, but for some reason, we missed that question, and a couple of people pointed it out. So I do want to ask you, let's start with Mr. Cox, if that's okay. Can you talk to us about your experience in rural Nebraska and what you would like to share with our participants today?
Oh, sure. Thank you. I think touching on that question is being a Black person in Nebraska, to me, means that you are purposely invisible. And what I mean by that is, as a person, you are seen. But I think others, instead of addressing the issue of color or race, they try to make it an invisible slate. Like you're my friend, so it doesn't matter if you're Black or white or whatever it is. And so issues that happen are ignored, and they don't, then like your white friends that you have tend to place certain assumptions onto you. So, well, we're best friends, so the stuff that's happening outside in the world really doesn't affect you and me because we're friends, even though that the climate and the racial climate in the world takes a heavy toll on Black people. So they assume, oh no, but we're friends, you're fine, you live in a small town, so it doesn't affect you, right? Because we're cool, so we don't have to talk about that. And so they like purposely push everything aside because they want to remain friends. They don't want to talk about what's currently going on in America or what has gone on in America. And that tends to create a big divide, especially when something happened, the George Floyd, death of George Floyd, the protests that followed. That creates a divide because they put their personal assumptions onto you to say, well, this shouldn't bother you because you live in Nebraska and that happened so far away in Minneapolis, and you're not like those people because you're my friend. So why are you upset about it? And then when you try to explain it and have a conversation, it becomes a deniability. They don't want to see that this goes on, and they don't want to see that it affects you, because then it leads to harder and harder conversations with you and with their friends. Because again, now, if you open their eyes to microaggressions, to other types of racism, now they have the responsibility to check their friends who do the same things. And they don't want that responsibility. They don't want to have that conversation. They still want to remain friends with you, but they want to treat you as if you were a clear blank slate and not understand that it is hard for you as an African American in Nebraska trying to deal with the racial climate of the world. So it becomes a very difficult balancing act to, you know, because you want to have friends. You don't want to sit there and say, oh, I'm just going to stick to myself. But it's also hard to try to discuss these things with your white friends that live in town who may have never gotten out of this small town and have only experienced it, and then therefore don't want to have that responsibility to talk about race amongst their other friends or even their family.
Thank you. You know, it is interesting, our identity and how important that is in the conversation of friendships and living in rural Nebraska. I'm wondering, Dr. Clark, what are your thoughts and how has that experience been for you?
Yeah, I think that Chris has raised some interesting points. I like his phrase, purposely invisible. You know, the experience living here in rural Nebraska, culturally, things have been quite different than the South, where I was born and raised. I grew up in rural Virginia, and it was farming and textiles. So a lot of the day-to-day practices and the kind of the cultural traditions of farming and living that life are the same. You know, people have been friendly, and others have struggled handling our presence and our intellectual wherewithal. What I mean by that is, you know, we represent a demographic of Black people and people of color that doesn't necessarily fit the stereotypical mold that some have for people of color, and in particular, Black Americans. Because of that, we experience a lot of unconscious bias, ignorance, and even at times racism. Overall, the experience living here, you know, while I would qualify it as being very similar to other places I've lived in the country, I will say that the idea that there aren't issues, as Chris referenced, is probably a common opinion. There's this inference that there isn't a problem with racism in our communities. We're all just seen as being the same. But I think what you realize when you're living it, that it's not quite that. It's just many people's biases will not allow them to see some of the subtleties. And I think that, you know, for myself, or for Chris, a lot of these issues can't be ignored. Like we can't look past them because they directly impact us. So we find ourselves, I think, constantly dealing with these challenges. And I know for myself, having that feeling of representing what Blackness is, representing what, you know, I would like to see the Black community portrayed as. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, you know, just the mental impact that has on you when you feel as if you have to be a representative, and not just a representative, but a really good representative of people who look like you and people who come from your ethnic community. So it's a challenge at times. And I think that, you know, not having a community base. If I just talk about practical day-to-day living, for example, you know, my wife has to drive an hour and a half to get her hair done. There are certain products that we can't purchase. We have to buy them online, or we have to go to Lincoln or Omaha because, you know, ethnic care products are not necessarily carried in abundance in the stores here. So there's kind of the challenge of practical day-to-day living, and then there are the challenges to the social aspect of being different in a community that has been for a while historically homogeneous. I think there's a huge Latinx community which is changing that, and I find that very promising. but still this idea of mostly interacting with people who look like you is quite commonplace in rural Nebraska.
Well, thank you both for sharing that. You know, the intricacies, the minute things, right, that you were talking about, but they are such a day-to-day thing that we need within our communities and within our households. And the fact that your wife, like you said, has to travel an hour plus to be able to get her hair done, that's a real thing that people may not think about. So let's talk then a little bit about what rural versus urban is. Both of you have lived in big cities. What has that been? What has that experience been for you? You've expressed your experience here in rural Nebraska. How does that look like compared to an urban setting? And Dr. Clark, can you start with that, please?
You know, there are quite a few differences, and I'll just kind of talk about the ones that have been really obvious, I guess, to me personally. You know, in most urban settings, there's a lot more diversity. So there are more people of color and also individuals who have lived around different people. So the idea of diversity is welcome, even sought after. There are different cultures to experience, which opens you to new ideas. Here in rural Nebraska, we just don't see that same level of diversity, that same desire to be exposed to different cultures. You know, in urban settings, there are more programs and organizations that are geared towards supporting diverse and inclusive practices. So even if you find yourself being challenged by some of these issues, there is a organization or some affinity group that is there to provide support. The last thing I guess I'll mention is, you know, the density of police. Like when you're living in an urban environment, there are far more police in urban settings, far more opportunities for police interactions, and that's not necessarily a good thing, whether it be through traffic stops, inside of shopping areas or restaurants, or in largely populated parts of the city that are highly populated by people of color. So as a result, I think the biggest impact has been to, say, for example, education. You know, in urban settings, the educational environment, the curriculum, those things are more diverse. And I haven't seen as much of that being in rural Nebraska.
Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit about education too. I look forward to having some answers as well in regards to education and our kids. Chris, what about New York?
New York is just a different animal altogether. I will say the difference is space. And I know Dr. Clark mentioned that in terms of density, like just walking in like a 2-block radius in New York City, you could probably hear 5 different languages being spoken. And then in the middle, they're each speaking a piece of another person's language to communicate with somebody else. So you become like semi-bilingual at an early age. So you learn enough Spanish to speak to somebody, or you learn enough Korean, or you learn enough Cantonese, or you learn enough Patois, which is like a Caribbean dialect. So you learn enough Russian. My grandmother knew how to speak Yiddish. So you learn enough languages to be able to converse with everyone and make everyone feel comfortable, and it's not a big deal. Whereas I feel in rural Nebraska, it becomes a big deal to the older generation. Like they don't want to know Spanish. They feel you should speak English. And it's like disrespectful that they have to learn a new language, or the incoming influx of Hispanic, men, women, children into town want to continue to speak Spanish. And I think there are some that feel threatened by that. If they're sitting eating and all of a sudden there's a group of family that are speaking Spanish, they immediately take it as they're talking about me. It's a weird it's a weird thing that happens. Whereas if they're sitting in a group and then there's a group of kids speaking Spanish, they immediately feel that that group of kids is talking about them, which then goes into another privileged conversation. Like, why do you feel that you're that important that these kids are talking about you? And then it leads to the whole you should speak English. We're in America, we speak English over here. And it's another way I think that happens that the population, the Spanish population, Hispanic population in rural Nebraska, they get denigrated and made to feel bad about themselves, which leads to identity issues because they feel they can't even speak their own native language. Now, the younger kids, the younger generation, they're actually learning Spanish in some of the schools, especially in the town where I live in. So they're making an attempt to have kids be bilingual, but I do know that some of their parents don't like it. They have them in the school because it becomes a status symbol. Oh, my kid is bilingual. But that's the outward feeling of it. The inward feeling is, why does my kid have to learn Spanish? Why does he have to learn English and math in Spanish? It's too much for them. Whereas the kids who have to learn English right away, they're learning everything in two languages at the same, but they don't get the same breaks or thought process when their grades aren't as good as others. So it's like it is also good. I don't want to sit there like I'm railing on it and like I hate where I live. I don't. Nebraska, or living in rural Nebraska, it's really beautiful. Like, New York is super dense and super populated, and it has its beautiful areas, but you're going to deal with high-rise buildings, traffic, noise 24/7. Like, when I first moved out here, moved to the Midwest, I couldn't sleep because I was used to people talking outside at night. I was used to cars going by. I was used to music and parties. And out here, 9 o'clock, it's quiet. 8:30, 9 o'clock, it's quiet. You can leave your door unlocked. You get parties, you invite everybody from the neighborhood or where you live at. I mean, small things are celebrated in big ways out here. Like, when I grew up in high school, we never had a homecoming or things like that. Because it's just you don't do that in city schools. That's not what they're going to spend their time on. Whereas here, they have parades and homecoming, and they celebrate academic success, and they have a lot more accessible, high academic programs. Whereas New York, you got to jump through 5,000 different hoops to get into an accelerated learner program because there's so many kids vying for that same program. So there are positives, but I think the underlying negatives are the fact that the people that live here and who may not have gotten out of this town, again, refuse to want to acknowledge that there's issues. And then that gap starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger between the different ethnic communities because they don't want to acknowledge that telling someone to only speak English is extremely offensive. Or making fun of them speaking Spanish is offensive, or making fun of the fact that there's different Mexican restaurants or Honduran restaurants or Guatemalan restaurants, making fun of that fact, that's extremely offensive, but they don't want to see it. They just see it as, oh, we're just having fun. They're okay with it. They don't bother. They never say anything about it. And that's where the issues come in.
Chris, the point I thought about when you were talking, this country does not have a designated national language. Like, English is not our designated national language. We don't have one. So the idea that, someone couldn't speak Spanish doesn't even really make sense if you're trying to base it on some nationality. And then the other thing was, if you are not a fan of diversity and inclusion, it's hard to get away from that in a big city. Like, you literally have to actively work to avoid diversity and inclusion. Whereas in rural parts of the country and even in rural Nebraska, there are a number of places that you can just kind of hide away or silo yourself away if you are not an advocate of diversity or being inclusive of others. So
It's different. Like I said, New York is you're New York is just going to be, you are going to have to learn how to deal with other people of all races, of all statures, and it becomes easy to float in and out of different worlds, so to speak. Whereas, which I think I'm grateful that I lived there, learned that, grew up there, because here you definitely see it as an issue. Like it's hard, like you said, it's hard for people to flow from one world to the next. And I think that's what all our diversity and inclusion training should be, is how to make that transition smooth and easy for people that never had to deal with it before.
Thank you both. You know, as a Latina bilingual Spanish speaking individual, I do appreciate both of you understanding the beauty, if we can say, about those differences, not only in us, but also in our languages and our cultures. And to some extent, that's what we're asking, is for us to be okay being us, right, in our homes, in our hometowns, in our home country. So it is very interesting hearing those conversations, and thank you both for sharing your experiences in rural Nebraska as well as in big cities. So we appreciate that. I do want to turn to education, if that's okay with both of you. There is a question in the Q&A box. That is something that I was going to ask about, is education. So the question that Eleanor Reeds asks is, what steps do you think need to be taken? I apologize. What steps do you think need to be taken by public and higher education leaders in Nebraska to combat systemic racism and anti-Blackness? Now that's a loaded question. I believe, you know, all of our questions are loaded and in depth, but if you can give us some thoughts in regards to how you would be, how you, one, as children, but two, as adults, and three, you know, both of you have been in the education field as well. How do you combat anti-Blackness? How do you combat systemic racism when it is possibly even in our history books that we're seeing history that is ill-written? You know, it's incorrect. Chris, I'll start with you.
I think that's the first thing, is actually admit that it exists, that systemic racism is a real thing. It is not a mythical unicorn that Black people pull out of their back pocket, that, you know, because we're not playing the race card. You know, it is a real thing. Like, there are reasons why there are very poor and crime-ridden areas that are not all the fault of the ethnic group that lives there. There were horrible real estate practices, bank practices that forced Black people or Hispanic people or Asian people into specific neighborhoods, and then the tax property and the property values went down, which means the schools don't get the same amount of funding as other schools do with higher property taxes. So there are reasons that these things happen. And I think as educators, to actually admit that, yes, there is systemic racism. There is a different starting point for Jamal than there is for Adam. There is a different, you're all running the same race, but there's a different starting point. And we have to understand that. And then we have to, with our educators, is we have to change the curriculum. We can't gloss over, we can't say, oh, Columbus, you know, in 1492 sailed the ocean blue. Like, we can't sit there and teach that, but then not teach the atrocities that Columbus perpetrated against the Native Americans when he landed in America. Like, we can't just skip over that and not teach kids that he literally, like, wiped out an entire group of people, you know, be it through slavery, through sickness, through rape, through mutilation. Like, we can't gloss over that. We can't gloss over what Leopold did in the African Congo with mutilating children to make their parents work harder. Like, if their dads weren't working harder, it wasn't anything for them to pull a 7-year-old kid and chop his arm off and then say, I will kill this kid if you don't work harder. But kids don't grow up learning that, and they don't learn what atrocities were exhibited on people of color and on people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. We gloss over it. We gloss over what happened with the Native Americans in America, manifest destiny, and the fact that they just took land. We just said, no, it's ours. We moved here. We're going to take it, and we're going to move you onto a small little reservation. And then we're going to give you alcohol as a gift, and then make fun of you, and for the rest of your life, exhibit the stereotype that Native Americans are all alcoholics. When the white people, the Americans, were the ones that introduced alcohol to that community in that way. And we don't talk about that, and we don't teach our kids about that. And I think that's a big part of what's happening now. And especially like we talked about in our first Zoom or Facebook Live panel discussion, is especially with the monuments. Oh, we won't know our history. We won't know our history. You guys don't know it now. You know a small portion of it that fit the narrative that we wanted, that America wanted to sell to kids to show America was the best. And we have to step away from this very xenophobic narrative and say, we need to teach everything. Because in that way, when kids make a choice, they are more informed and they can make a better choice. So we have a better group and a more educated group of voters, a more educated group of business owners who are willing to be more diverse because they understand the serious downfalls that can lead to not wanting to be diverse, to not wanting to accept others based on the color of their skin or the language that they speak. So educators have a very big role that they can play, but I also know that a lot of educators have a hard system that they have to fight to be able to change the curriculum as well. But I think that's where it starts, is agreeing that it has happened, and then changing the curriculum and changing the narrative and teaching the entire history versus sugarcoating it.
Dr. Clark, what do you think? I mean, I agree 100% with Chris, and you know, it's just the setting. You work in, Chris has worked with high school, middle school kids currently, and what is your setting, or what is your experience working with college, in the college educational setting, higher learning, and how, what can we do, you know, as professors, as students, as administrators, to be able to combat anti-Blackness and systemic racism?
Well, I think one of the things that's most important in this discussion is we have to be the examples that we want to set. You know, we have to be certain that as educators, we're doing our best to address our biases, our cultural or family related habits that, you know, color how we see others. So what I mean by that is, you know, you think about K-12 settings where, you know, the schools are quite, I would say, community-based, right? You're living in the same communities as the teachers and the principals. So, you know, we have to represent a diverse lifestyle, not just in the classroom, but in the community. When students of color see a white instructor, or if a Black instructor sees white students, you know, in the community, there has to be that same interaction, that same willingness to communicate and to be open to diversity as you would have in the classroom. Another thing that we've got to be conscious of is let's not wait for racism to occur to address it. Let's take an active role in teaching against racism and other issues like sexism as well. So, you know, creating, for example, a diversity-centered project that requires students to communicate and engage with other students who don't look like them. So in essence, we're creating, or we're framing curriculum around this idea of diversity and inclusion, so that, for example, this idea of racism or the discussions that we have, that's not just, section 3 of module 4, but it's an ongoing learning process that's incorporated into every aspect, every topic in the class. Lastly, what I'll say is we have to be certain there's equity in the classroom. And I know many of you have probably seen memes that they have out about the difference between equity and equality. I think that we've understood the idea of equality. We provide the same tools, the same resources to each student. However, there's more to equity than just equal resources. We also have to consider some of the factors that are playing into why students who have the same resources don't reach the same achievements academically. That gets us into looking at issues of socioeconomics, looking into issues of bias that may be impacting how students are being educated. We have to be considerate of this idea that if we're teaching all students, then we can't continue to have a curriculum that only represents white America. Like, we have to make substantive changes to the curriculum so that any individual, regardless of color, regardless of race, sexual orientation, any of these other discriminators that are commonly imposed on people, we have to create coursework that makes everyone feel included. So at the end of the day, whether you are a brown student or you are a white student, you're in an environment that is enriching you as an American citizen and preparing you for a future of success, not implying that others are smarter than you or that you've got to do something extra to be successful, but creating an environment where we actively work in being equitable in our education. And I realize that, that's tough because a lot of our leaders, we see this, on the collegiate level, we see this, through K-12, we see it all throughout academia, but, people have a hard time admitting what they don't know. And so, it does not make leadership bad simply because they're unaware of how to solve a problem. Being ignorant to a solution is not a bad thing. Being ignorant just means you do not know. And I think that if we can move to a point where our educational leaders are willing to admit that we just don't know, but more importantly, rely on the individuals who do. Like, actually listen to the people who can provide you valuable insight on how to correct problems, regardless of whether they're in leadership or regardless of whether they are subordinates or in the community. So as leaders, we have to be willing to learn. I've talked more about diversity and inclusion. I've started taking a series of courses that are directly related to diversity and inclusion because I want to further my knowledge base. It's not just enough that I have these experiences as a person of color, but I want to put it in some kind of academic context so that I can effectively relay information to others that will assist them at improving how they see the world, how they see themselves, how they see the impact of diversity and inclusion on creating a more productive environment for all of us.
Thank you both. And if I may, both of you were college athletes. We have Hastings College in the room. We have York College in the room. We have Central Community College. We have some high ed individuals in the room. And one of the conversations has been in regards to college athletes being recruited to rural settings and how, you're affected as an individual. I know that for me, and I know just sharing a quick experience, it was very important for my professors and the people around me to support me in in that college setting, not only just in the academic piece, but also the social piece, the social system, right? And having that support system in that academic setting for me to succeed and graduate within 6 years, which, the graduation rate should be 4 years. So Dr. Clark, can you talk a little bit about your experience in a college setting as a college athlete, and how, let's talk about what worked. What did the college professors, administrators do to help you succeed as a college athlete?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that, because I have some, I don't know, I think I still battle with some of those experiences that occurred 25 years ago. And the reason I say that is because, you know, football is what really motivated me to attend my undergrad institution. And it was interesting because, you know, if I was in the football setting on the field, like, you know, people widely acknowledge the fact that offensive linemen are some of the most intelligent people on the football field. I played offensive center, and, you know, people commonly talk about how centers are very intelligent individuals. They have these high functioning intellectual abilities. That was on the football field. But in the classroom, no one saw me as this up and coming physicist. I was a jock who was there to play football. And so the reason that I maybe struggled in classes was because I wasn't focused on my studies, which wasn't true at all. It was just the perception that because there were very few people of color at the institution at that time, and the fact that most of them played sports, you know, that connection there created this this bias in which, you know, people thought that the only reasons that we were there were athletics, and that I didn't care about my academic well-being. I only cared about playing football. That wasn't the case. And it was tough in that moment when you're young, when you are, you know, you're raw when it comes to talent, when it comes to learning, you're trying to figure it out. I didn't feel as if I had the mentors that I needed in order to be guided through that process. I didn't feel like it wasn't until I got to graduate school that I was able to connect with someone who really focused on me as an intellectual and not me as some athlete or some other factor. When I became a professor and started teaching physics, you know, I had a number of student athletes in my class. And one of the things that I used to do for them was I would take them to the side and I would say to them, hey, listen, I know what you guys are doing. I know that you play sports. You know, sometimes it would be women who were into athletics. I would say the same thing. It's like, you have to realize that although you're here and athletics are important, I know how passionate you are. Don't forget that the only reason you have an athletic program is because of an academic institution. Be certain that you focus as much on your academics as you do your sports, because, and I'm just talking statistics, the majority of athletes that, you know, play an NCAA sport will not make it to the professional level. And you have a higher chance of getting a PhD, a Juris Doctorate, an MD in any field than you do playing a professional sport. So don't forget about the fact that you have to be a well-rounded individual. And I would say, more importantly, as you being a person of color, it is going to be extremely important that you have high academic marks. So I tried to provide those levels of insight that I didn't get when I was an undergrad. And I really do feel like it had an impact on my educational experience. I could have been more prepared, but I was young and I was ignorant and I just didn't know, and I did not have the guidance that I needed to help me to become a better student. I hope that we, or I and myself, can do a better job of helping students along the way and provide that insight that they need in order to understand the importance of education.
Thank you, Chris.
It feels good to hear someone else say the very same things that I've been holding on to. I'm not gonna say 25 years, but at least a good 22. You're just a little bit older than me. And I went to school. So here's the thing: when a black athlete of color, whatever, when they go to a university, especially if it's a complete a complete culture shock from where they live, it almost needs you need to have like uh I can't remember it, like when you first get to college you have like
Like your
uh,
orientation.
your orientation. Yeah, you need an orientation, and they need to, if they have any professors of color, they need to do like a 2-day orientation with you to get you prepared for what you're about to experience for the next 4 years of your life. And I went to college. I went to college in Sioux City. So, and I'm coming directly from New York City, hanging out, running around in the Bronx and Brooklyn to Sioux City, Iowa. Like, I had braids and a long chain, I wasn't prepared to not see someone that looked like me. Like I wasn't prepared for that at all. Like I was not, because I grew up seeing everyone. I was not prepared growing up and like literally stepping into Mayberry and then understanding that I wasn't going to see any African American teachers, like, or at least the fact I was only going to see one in my entire 4 years of school. I was going to have one African American professor who I think suffered from mentor burnout because she tried to be the mom to all of the Black athletes that were there. And she was our mom. Like we had Thanksgiving dinner because most of us were from out of state. And when I mean out of state, Chicago, California, New York, Florida, like we weren't from Omaha, so we could just go home. I mean, we had to stay and live on campus, and she was our mom. And she was also our professor, and she was trying to make sure we had good grades, but she was just trying to make sure we were surviving and we weren't doing anything stupid while we're out there because we felt like we were desperate or we needed money or we needed this. And so I think she ended up suffering. I need to make sure you're alive. Did you eat today? Do you have enough money to wash your clothes? Like that was what she became. And I think that became the primary, and school and making sure you had your grades and all that became secondary. She just wanted to make sure we were surviving as young men and women in a very, very different lifestyle. And I think that's what doesn't get said a lot to athletes when they're being recruited, because coaches go to Texas, they go to California, and they say, hey, you want to come play football in Iowa? You want to come play football in Nebraska? You're going to be a star here. You can play out here. But they don't tell them the climate that they're going to step into. And I also don't think the coaches and the faculty are equipped to deal with the emotional baggage that is going to come with some of these players. And I'm not talking about like behavioral issues. I'm talking about, okay, like I need to go work 2 jobs, coach, because my mom is struggling back home. Or how can I get an off-campus apartment because I need to bring my brother here with me because he's getting in trouble. So I got to take care of my brother, or I got to take care of my 2 little brothers and put them into school. And so I'm their parent guardian while I'm in practice and I have night school. Like I don't think they're aware of that baggage that comes with some of the athletes they recruit. And that never gets talked about when those athletes leave school. It's just, oh, another case of a Black kid. He couldn't deal with it academically. Just like you said, instead of understanding that there were levels of things he was fighting through just to get to class every day, it becomes, yep, he failed out. That's why we recruited 8, because we knew 4 of them were going to leave. And and if you do make it through, it kind of hardens you a little bit, like Dr. Clark said, and you hold on to it for a long time. Because even though I like my university, I was at college, I like Morningside College, and there were some very good professors that were white there, and some people I still am in contact now while I'm kind of taking some classes as well now. I remember if it was not for my religion, RBV, Religions, Beliefs, and Values professor, Dr. Venable Ridley, and then Dr. Lopez, which is the only other female professor, and she taught Spanish and she taught women's history. If it wasn't for them watching out for us, I don't know how far or how long I would have lasted, because I was one of those kids who came with a lot of baggage. So I think schools, coaches, faculty need to do a better job of understanding what's actually coming with this kid other than his athletic prowess. And then also orientating the new college student to understanding that it's going to be a very big difference. Like Dr. Clark said, you will be accepted once you're on the football field. When you're playing games, you will be accepted. But once that helmet comes off and you're in the community, you are just another Black kid that they are scared of you dating their daughter. They're scared of you walking through their stores, and they're scared of you walking through their neighborhoods. And so it's a big balancing act that wears emotionally and mentally on kids when they go to college and play sports.
I think that investment in time and care for us as college students when we go to college, and understanding, like you said, that background that we come with, we don't just come to learn, but we also have so much with us. That comes through to all people of color. I definitely understand that piece. Um, and I'm only trying to imagine both of you with mentors, orientations, and the potential, right? That we could have, I mean, we're great already, right? But the potential that we have, the potential that our kids have, kids of color, these college students that are hungry for education, but if we don't invest in them, if we don't give them that time, the ability to understand that they're coming with more than just your normal kid, uh, we're failing as a system. And it would be so intentional for all of our colleges to understand that, and our schools as well. So thank you for both of those answers. I do have one final answer, and again, all of these questions were so interesting, were brought to us before, right, from the first conversation. So just know we're trying to answer all of your questions. I know already that we're not going to be able to answer all the questions in the Q&A. I apologize ahead of time for that, but I do want you all to know that these are all questions that you as participants have brought on before. And we are getting some really awesome answers and some insight as to how we can help people of color, not only in rural settings, but in all settings at this moment. So one of the questions that I sent to you beforehand was our mental health piece. I want to acknowledge that mental health is not easy to talk about. As a Latina, a conservative, we don't know anything. We try to hide everything. There is no such thing as mental health issues in our society. What do you mean? The first thing we think about is, or if we were to talk about anybody that may have mental health issues, the first word that comes up is crazy, right? Oh, your tia, your tia. I'm trying to be careful with my tias here. I don't want to call anybody the wrong thing. So hypothetically, I have a tia something out there, and the first thing that they say is, "Oh, está loca," she's crazy. And that's where we go, rather than say, how can we help our family members? How can we help our kids? How can we help those that may be struggling with mental health? And through all of these questions that we have talked about, you both have talked a little bit about, the mental health piece, that how it has affected you emotionally, to, not have a mentor, to live in a rural setting where you may not feel like you belong, or to see hate maybe more constant, or not being more welcomed. So let's talk a little bit about mental health, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. Again, delicate topic, but one, thank you for sharing. And two, I think it's so powerful for Black men to share their emotions in regards to mental health. So I appreciate you both on touching that topic and your willingness to be able to speak on it. So Dr. Clark, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep my response brief because I want to try to answer as many questions as we can. Here's what I'll say. I saw in the news just recently, I think this was in Los Angeles County, there were two Black teenagers who were attacked by, I think there was a homeless individual who had a knife, and they fought this guy off with their skateboards. Someone called the police, and shared that these two kids had been attacked by a guy with a knife. Someone else called the police and shared that these two kids had got into a fight with a guy with a knife. When the police showed up, even though there were bystanders who told the police that the two young African Americans were victims and had been attacked and they were defending themselves, these two teenagers they had assault rifles pointed at them. They were arrested and put into the vehicles at gunpoint. And later they were released because they found out, just like the bystanders were telling them, they were defending themselves. So now, if we think about just in that moment, what level of trauma that will cause those teenage boys, and if you think about the impact it's going to have on how they see police, how they see being policed in our country for the rest of their lives, I think maybe this can give you a glimpse into what occurs in a person of color's life from childhood to adulthood. And if you think about all the experiences that we've talked about, you know, it creates this perpetual state of trauma. Sometimes, you know, I feel like I'm just overwhelmingly stressed, just overwhelmingly anxious about issues. And when it comes to things like interacting with police, you know, those feelings are exacerbated. You know, a couple of months ago, my wife was pulled over by a police officer on the way to the eye doctor. And she was literally shaking. Like, the experience had her literally shaking in the car. Now, if you think about how that might have been, you know, interpreted by the police officer, he may have thought that she was, you know, nervous because she was guilty of something. The only thing she was guilty of was being afraid that that interaction was going to go wrong and end in some negative experience. I can't verbalize, as a person of color, like the level of trauma that you experience constantly, whether it's direct or whether it's indirect through watching people who look like you being brutalized, being killed by people who are supposed to be supporters. People are supposed to keep you safe. In my mind, it has just had an impact on every aspect of how I live my life. And honestly, as an American, like, I'm really tired of it. Like, I'm tired of experiencing this, but I have yet to come to a reasonable conclusion as to how I move past it until things change in our communities.
This is hard. So mental health is extremely, or mental health issues extremely prevalent in my family. Growing up under, okay, so my mother is bipolar, and just so you understand, I guess, where my apprehensions of talking or trying to word it in a good way. So growing up under that, and anybody who knows anybody who's bipolar, let's just multiply it by like 100. And then, but being in a situation and not being allowed to talk about it. Because if you're a Black kid and you have a parent who has any type of mental health disorder, you literally can get taken out of the house. Like, CPS will be there and be like, oh, this is an unsafe living environment, you're out of here. So you can't talk about it to anybody. No one in your family acknowledges it outright. No one says anything. They just say, oh, that's so-and-so. She was like that her whole life, or she's a little off, or she can get a little, you know, like little side comments. And then as you grow up, what really starts to tip the meter of the anger, the PTSD, the aggravation for it is you start hearing little things from family members, whereas they're supposed to be comments, but as you get older, you understand that they weren't. They're like, oh man, you're doing so good for yourself, or you really made it. And you really understand that that's because they knew what was going on and ignored it, the issues that were going on, and they're surprised that you got as far as you got. And they're like, man, you really like got out of there. I did not expect that. But and that's what's growing up in a Black household, or ethnic, or a household of color, anything like that. It's a no topic. You don't speak about your uncle or your mom or so and so who is possibly schizophrenic or possibly bipolar or whatever diagnosis that is out there now. You don't even speak about it. Even Black kids, when I was growing up, we weren't ADHD, we were hyperactive. That's how we were described. Oh no, he's just hyper. That's what we were described as, because we're not going to a doctor. You're not going to get labeled by something, because the first thing my mother ever told me was, if you get labeled one time, you're going to be labeled for your whole life. So if we go to the doctor and there's something wrong with you, then that something will be wrong with you for the rest of your life. You will never be just Chris. You'll be, oh, that's the kid with ADHD, or that's the kid who has a mental issue, or that's the kid who whatever. And if you have a parent that has a mental issue and they go get labeled, then next thing you know, if something happens where you act out in school, now CPS or the school's involved, and oh, well, it's not safe, can't be there, you got to get out of that environment, and you start breaking up homes. So the fact that we don't talk about it is a fear that you're going to label us, among other things that African Americans are labeled, as being lazy, as just being hypersexualized, as being thugs, as criminals. Now you're adding another label. Now we're crazy. And now that label gives you entrance to now break up our family or break up our community even more. So we're like, no, we're just going to stuff it down deep and we're going to deal with it. And again, for our educators that are in a group, so why I say PTSD, so when you get kids in school, where when things start getting loud, you see them start getting a little antsy, or they start looking at the door, or you realize, why do some kids always sit next to the door? That's because they need an escape route. It's not because they don't want to pay attention. I don't sit with my back to doors. I don't sit near my back near windows. I know where the exits are when I go into somebody's house. I'm not going to get trapped, because if I get trapped, the whole building's coming down. Like, I don't want to be trapped. And kids in school don't want to be trapped. And you got to understand that if there's mental health issues at home, kids may not be eating. So when they come to school, or they may not be sleeping because their parent may be experiencing a manic episode and has kept them up all night. And so they go to school at 8 o'clock in the morning, exhausted, and the kid falls asleep and he's getting yelled at. And why are you sleeping? You're just lazy. And then he spazzes out and yells at his teacher. But no one sees the effects that happened before. So like, mental health is just a domino of issues that kids and adults have to deal with. And as educators, it's kind of pointed it strictly to them, or people in this Zoom or in this panel who want to help. The person you deal with on that day, you have no idea what has happened in the hours before you meet them. And you have to be aware of that as to how you respond or interact with them, because you don't know what happened at home in the morning. So we can't be so reactionary to what's going on right now, because right now may not be the reason that this kid is blowing up or this person is blowing up. It may be because there was no other outlet for them 5 hours ago, and you're their emotional outlet. And that's why after they firmly let all their emotions out, then you can actually talk to them. Because as Black men, we don't really have anybody to talk to. I'm not going to talk to my wife, because I tell all the time, it's like, if I vent to you, it's like me dumping the water out of my sinking boat into your sinking boat. So I can't be trying to drown you while I'm trying to save myself. And I can't talk to all my other African American friends because we're going through the same problem. And I can't talk to my white friends because they don't want to admit there's a problem. So that's why we get podcasts and we talk to ourselves, because there's no available help for us to accurately describe what's going on. Because once we do that, people feel it's open season to criticize our emotions, which then leads to our emotional outbursts just to represent ourselves as real or just to defend our viewpoints. And like Dr. Clark said, it becomes extremely exhausting trying to always defend your emotional state or trying to always hide your emotional state, because no one wants to be the angry Black man or the angry Black woman. So every time we say, hey, hi, and people, oh my God, he's so nice, we're like a duck on the pond, smooth on the top, and we're going crazy under the water. So it's a very delicate.
Oh no, you really touched on some good points. And just really quickly, people may be listening thinking, oh, well, what Chris just explained happens to all people, all young people, whether they're Black or white. And the point that I think, we want people to take away from this is that may be true. However, the resources that are available, the means by which we address these challenges in the community, they greatly differ depending on whether you grow up in a community that's largely populated by white people, or you grow up in a community that's largely populated by Blacks. You add into the equation socioeconomics, and what you really have is this environment, and you touched on this earlier, you were talking about redlining, right? Environments that have been orchestrated in ways that create low poverty communities. So a lot of these issues that impact mental wellness, they are exacerbated in these communities. The interactions that are occurring with the police, the interactions that are occurring with people in authority, it creates an environment in which mental health is attacked. It is slowly but surely eroded without there being the resources in place to shore these young people back up. And that's the difference. And that's what I think creates these environments in which you say, well, why do we see this so highly focused in this area as opposed to others? This is all part of an orchestrated process for separating and isolating our communities that started in the 50s and in the 60s.
And even, to some extent earlier than that, Dr. Clark, and I think that just touches on history again and learning our history. I want to thank you both for sharing the mental health piece. I think that's very important. And if I may also add the need for people of color having mental health therapists that are people of color, that therefore understand these experiences that you both currently are going through, is so necessary at this moment. And living in rural Nebraska, we know that that's limited, but we also know that there's kiddos growing up, and I know that we're going to have some more people of color that become therapists. But at the very least, if we do have white therapists in the room, having that understanding of, race is part of an identity. Therefore, we need to talk about it. So thank you both. Yeah, yes, go ahead.
I didn't mean to jump in. I just want to say very quickly, if we do have any health professionals that are listening today or that will be listening in the future, I will say from experience, if you do meet with an African American and you are, in a therapy session, please treat the person and not be in awe of the story. And it becomes very frustrating when you tell your life story and they're completely enthralled and amazed that you survived and they forget to treat you. And then it becomes, tell me more about this or tell me more about that, but with no treatment to follow. It's just, they're just engraved. You've become must-see TV. And I think if you're going to treat African Americans, please treat them and let them tell their story and explain, and then treat them and find out what the underlying issues are instead of treating them as a Netflix documentary.
Thank you. Yes, I 100% agree. Treat the person first. And I do want to now move towards the Q&A section, if that's okay with both of you. We have some really good questions. The top of the question is in the news. It came up yesterday in regards to the vice presidential pick. I do need to do a disclaimer. We are nonprofit. We are not partisan. So just be aware that this, again, is Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox's personal experiences and thoughts in regards to the Democratic vice presidential pick. The question specifically says, please share your thoughts on Kamala Harris's nomination as vice president on the Democratic ticket. And that's from John Pershing out of Hastings. Chris?
Okay, so here's my thoughts. I have a wait and see attitude because politics, regardless of who is nominated, who is president, I think as Black people, we have to know we have not won the lotto. And I think that expectation, like when President Obama was elected, I think a lot of African Americans is like, we won the lotto. It's going to change tomorrow. And not fully understanding all of the hoops and the barriers that are put in place for things to get done in the White House, and especially by an African American president. Same thing is going to be with Representative Kamala Harris. There's going to be a lot of barriers that are going to be put in place to her trying to get things done, be it public opinion, be it legal doctrine, whatever it may be. So yes, am I happy? Because again, it shows a bit of forward progress, but my pessimistic side is like, well, they probably just did that because of the current climate in America. Like, if the past 3 months hadn't happened, is she the Democratic nominee for vice president? If the past 3 months didn't happen, if the Democrats aren't trying to purposely get the Black vote, because they're waving out there right now, because a lot of African Americans don't want to vote for Trump because they think it's proposing or promoting a racist climate in America. Not that there hasn't been it, but they're like, you can just be loud and proud about it and be racist now. And so your pessimistic side is like, this is just a horse and pony show, a dog and pony show. They're just doing this to grab our vote, to placate us. And will anything legislatively, will that change within the next 4 years? But also, as your optimistic side, you're like, this is good for women. This is good for Black women. This is good for women of color, because there's a young group of representatives and senators, of women that are looking to really change this country. But again, public opinion is going to be completely divided. It's going to become slander. Again, it's like the PTSD. Like, I'm waiting for people to start just saying outlandish stuff about her, which has already happened. They already talked about her sleeping her way to the top. Like, that's the first thing we already talking about now. Okay, okay, So I guess I'm excited for it. And my optimistic side and my pessimistic side, I'm worried that it was just a vote grab. It was just something to put out there to placate the African American voters, to gain that vote so the Democrats can get into the White House. That's where I stand on that one.
Thank you. Dr. Clark?
Yeah, just quickly, I'll say, I think it really was coming down to two choices, Susan Rice or Kamala Harris. Depending on where you fall on some of the, on her past body of work, some will argue that she supported some of the same issues and challenges that we've talked about today and when she was Attorney General, and her I guess hesitancy in changing some of the policies that directly impacted how people of color were being policed. But what I'll say is, regardless of whether you agree with the choice of Kamala Harris or whether it should have been someone else, I think that it's a very positive thing for the Democratic Party. There has to be diversity and inclusion. We have to move away from this idea of talking about it and not being about it. And I think that in terms of there being a diverse ticket, this is a good thing. Whether you are a Democrat or whether you are a Republican. What I will just say, and then I'll move on, I will ask all women, whether you are conservative, whether you are a liberal, pay close attention to how she's addressed. We've seen this before, and we know it's coming, but what we should not do, and if we want to talk about inclusion and being diverse and equitable, we cannot allow her to be attacked for simply being a woman. Like, you may not agree with her political views, you may not agree with where she, lands on issues, but she should not be attacked for being a woman, and she definitely should not be attacked for being a person of color. So, you can sling mud, but let's just do it and be fair. And if you're willing to sling it at her, be willing to sling it at others. So, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But if you're an advocate for diversity and inclusion, then you've got to be glad that we're at least seeing more of this now in politics.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. So Charlene Brown did ask today in regards to just repeating the question from last time, which I think everybody in the room also wants to know some more about, is what, let's see, let me phrase it right. Even though we asked what the speakers would like white people to do to help the situation last time, perhaps they would like a second chance to answer it, as I'm sure they have really thought about it afterwards. Any thoughts about what white people can do in rural Nebraska? How can they help support, be an ally? Any additional thoughts? I know, Dr. Clark, you had a list, and I was trying to look for it, but I don't want to I don't want to lose my concentration either. So I don't know if you still have that list handy. I know you had it handy last time, but any additional thoughts in regards to how white people can be good allies to people of color and Black people?
I can find that list and resend it out. I'll say that in the wake of the passing of Representative John Lewis, we should take a page from his book. If you see something that's wrong, you have to speak up. You've got to be a representative for what's right. Not a lot is going to change in our country until we all become very passionate and very active about creating that change. So, we know, this isn't speculation, we know that a lot of white Americans are in places where they observe racist behavior or biased behavior. And what I'm saying is, as someone who wants to be a supporter of diversity, they want to see more equitable practices in our country, you've got to speak up. You've got to be willing to stand in the wake of some of that negativity. You've got to speak up on behalf of individuals who are being targeted or marginalized. I mean, it is the only way that we're going to make change. You're going to lose friends. You're going to have people who are going to label you as a sympathizer for people of color. But you're going to have to be okay with your social status in the community being challenged. And I know that many people are not, but you've got to be willing to be an advocate for change. You've got to be willing to be an advocate for those who don't have a voice. And oftentimes that's going to mean speaking up on behalf of people of color. So just be courageous, be bold, be willing to sacrifice your social standing for what's right.
I would add on to that make sure that when you're being an advocate, that you're doing it publicly. Because I think what happens is a lot of people in white America, they privately talk to their African American friends or coworkers and say that this just isn't right, or there shouldn't be racism, or I can't believe the police officers did this, or whatever it may be. They do it privately, but they still sit around with their buddies, and their buddies make racist jokes and they don't say anything. And that's where the disconnect comes in. And just like Dr. Clark was saying, you have to advocate and you have to do it publicly. If you hear another mom talking disrespectfully, oh, that little brown girl or whatever, you have to check that behavior. It is a responsibility for you to check that. And yes, it's going to lead to a backlash, but you can't privately wish something stopped and then publicly you don't do it. And that is, I think that is our biggest disconnect. And especially in rural Nebraska, is kind of what I was saying earlier. Privately, they may say or agree with you on these issues, but publicly they don't, or they're just silent. And so, an omission means it's acceptable. And then that's where we keep running into. So if you want to be an ally, please be an ally in public and in private as well. And also, if you're going to join a group to advocate for a better climate in America or a better climate in your community, then come into that group knowing that you're going to have to earn your status in that group. Just because you're white does not mean that you are at the top and your opinion is the end all be all. Come into that group, work hard, and work yourself into a position where we need your opinion. There's a term called white savior. And just because you join the group, that doesn't mean you're the tipping point to making that group a national group or making that group be on a better scale for change. It just means you're another person, an ally we need in the fight, and we need you to come ready to work.
Yeah, I posted in the chat. There's some information about a book called Life of a Klansman, Family History and White Supremacy by Edward Ball. I posted that because that was the other thing that I would encourage people to do, is to educate themselves. This is related to a story of how a family has come to terms with their experiences with a family member who was a very racist, a white supremacist. I encourage everyone to work towards a point in which you can have discussions and take ownership of history, whether that's directly related to your own family lineage or the country, so that we can have discussions about these topics and we can learn from it. If you're in a work environment, corporate America or academia, if you're in a meeting, if you're in a boardroom, if you are present and you're watching someone be marginalized, if you're watching a person of color being talked over or has a great idea and people are not acknowledging it, if you see this occurring to women, speak up, be an advocate in that situation. Affirm the fact that someone has made a good point or an excellent statement. Don't be silent in your affirmation, because that's not affirmation at all. So just be conscious of how you are actively engaging everyone that is in your space.
All right, those are great points, and I completely agree. It's 12:30. I do want to be mindful of your time. I appreciate Dr. Beverly Clark and Mr. Christopher Cox for coming and joining us again for this wonderful conversation. I do have a few slides left in regards to resources, but I did want to thank you both. This has been so enlightening, and as you know, there could be a part 3, 4, 5. I mean, we need a COVID series, right? Because there is so much more in regards to COVID as well. But I do want you all to know that we appreciate your time, and we're so honored. And again, I'm honored for your trust and having me moderate this conversation. So thank you so much for that. Any final thoughts? I know it's 12:31, so I want to be respectful.
Dr. Clark, you want to go first? Because I know you have to head out.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this. I encourage everyone who is participating, everyone who will listen, to continue to be passionate, continue to be willing to learn, willing to communicate with others that are different. Find opportunities to put yourself into an environment where you are different, where everyone, you're the minority, so that you can start to gain a feeling, an understanding of what it means to be the only person. I promise you, it will create empathy that you never thought you had.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'd like to say thank you again for having me as well. I really enjoy listening to Dr. Clark as well too, so that's always a good bonus for me, especially being an offensive lineman. Thank you for just having this talk in general, even if it wasn't myself on there. Thank you for having it in general. And I would just like to add, if there's anyone who has a question that they feel they want to ask, that they didn't get a chance to get an answer from it. I know Gladys said she'll share my information or our information to others. Please feel free to email or write, or I mean, I have time. I can answer a few questions. I know it's just so much. So however you want to try to get your question answered, I will do my best to try to answer it.
Thank you. Thank you both again. I'm going to go ahead and move forward and share my screen with some resources. I don't have your contact information on the slide, but I do want to share with everybody that if you are interested in following up with Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox in regards to maybe facilitating another conversation for your campus or anything like that, or an interview for a news piece, please reach out to me. I will make sure to make those introductions to Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox so you all can get a hold of them. Thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give you
Thanks.
some resources. All right, so just in regards to resources, NAMI is the National Alliance of Mental Health. I do have them as a resource. They have a listing. They have currently said they have a variety of mental health resources available for people of color, and they are sharing some examples. So I did share that link, and I will be sharing that link with people that registered. We also have teaching tolerance for our educators in the room. Their mission is to help teachers in schools educate children and youth to be active participants in a diverse democracy. We also have facing history. Facing history in ourselves uses lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. Let's see. We also will share the resources that we shared the last time. ACLU nationwide, they have information in regards to defending protests and their rights of protesters. Black Lives Matters also has resources, a listing of them. A Stand Against Racism Toolkit provided by the YWCA of Grand Island, and then an anti-racism resource kit from Tasha K. That was developed by Tasha, and we want to make sure we give her credit. So just letting you know that those are some resources that we will be providing. We also want to, a lot of you have asked about history. I continue to mention history, and we have continued to mention history. Great Plains Black History Museum, we encourage you to donate to them, and their mission is preserving, celebrating, and educating all people of the contributions and achievements of African Americans throughout the Great Plains of America. And the Center for Rural Affairs, as a thank you to both Chris and Dr. Clark, we are going to gift them a book that we were able to purchase in Great Plains Black History Museum. It is called Black Experience Through the Lens of Rudy Smith. Rudy Smith is a photographer for the Omaha World Herald. And these are gifts for our panelists, but I also want to encourage you again to be able to support the history that we have here on this land. And then that image that you see, it's the same image that we had last time, the Whitty Homesteaders pose in front of a church near Brownlee, Nebraska, and that's northeast of Lincoln. This is a conversation, and it is a conversation of a rural experiences series. Our next conversation will be mental health and race in rural Nebraska. That will be September 9th from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. We then will have a conversation of Native Americans' experiences in rural Nebraska and the Latinx culture in rural Nebraska as well. We are having those conversations coming up here within the next few months. So stay in touch. We will be sending them out to those that have registered, and we have your contact information. Again, you will receive an email with resources mentioned and a video of the conversation that we had today. We'll record it. It should be with you within a week. So we do ask a little bit of patience in regards to transferring it to a YouTube and then getting you that information via email. We thank our sponsors and co-hosts, ACLU of Nebraska, YWCA of Adams County, YWCA of Granite Island, and the Center for Rural Affairs. Thank you, everyone, and especially Dr. Clark and Mr. Cox for sharing their experience with us and trusting me in facilitating. Again, Jordan, without you, I don't know where we would be in regards to Facebook Live and Zoom and the chat and Q&A. So thank you, Jordan Fireherm, my partner in crime, for handling the IT. You're welcome to contact myself or Jordan if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you again. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful day.